All right, so as I said, we left off in period 3. Try it now. There we go. I'm going to blow through this pretty quickly. I leave this up here just because I want to at least bring it up and let you see it, because it's the visual and the repetition helps us to remember these periods of Old Testament history, get everything in its proper spot. The period before the flood, after the flood, Patriarchal, which is what we're on now, bondage and Exodus, wilderness wanderings, conquest and possession. Those round out the first 6. And then picking up with 7, Judges, United Kingdom, Divided Kingdom, Judah alone, exile or captivity, and then the restoration. Now those with what they cover, before the flood goes from creation to the flood, then from the flood to the call of Abraham, and then the call of Abraham to the death of Joseph is a patriarchal period. Again, that's what we're looking at today. Bondage and Exodus, death of Joseph to the crossing of the Red Sea. Wilderness wanderings is crossing the Red Sea to crossing the River Jordan. It's going to mark the entrance into the Promised Land. Conquest and possession is crossing the Jordan to the death of Joshua. Judges, death of Joshua to the anointing of Saul as their first earthly king. United Kingdom, anointing of Saul to the death of Solomon. Divided Kingdom, death of Solomon to the fall of the northern kingdom. And then, of course, Judah alone is from the fall of the northern kingdom to the fall of the southern kingdom. Exile is from the fall of the southern kingdom to the decree of King Cyrus that allowed the Jews to return home. Restoration is from that decree of Cyrus to the conclusion of Nehemiah's work. Those are your 12 periods of Old Testament history. Again, we're in period number 3. Covered probably about half of this last week, and we'll finish that up today. This is called the Patriarchal period. Again, I will remind you, don't confuse this with the Patriarchal dispensation. We talk about a Patriarchal dispensation. That covers basically from creation until the receiving of the law of Moses. That's a whole dispensation of mankind. Then you have the dispensation that we refer to as the Mosaic dispensation. That will go all the way, depending on how definite and exact you want to be, it goes to the cross, we often say, but it was about 50 days after Jesus' crucifixion, the day of Pentecost. You recall, the first day of Pentecost after his resurrection is when the new dispensation officially, if you want to use that term, began. The gospel was, we might use the term, inaugurated, and so people began to obey the gospel, about 3,000 that day, and that began the Christian dispensation. So 3 dispensations of mankind. But we're talking about the Old Testament period that we refer to, period number 3, as the Patriarchal. We covered all this, so I'm going to blow through it very quickly. Call of Abraham to the death of Joseph is what it covers. We read about it in Genesis 12 through 50. First read about Abraham in Genesis 11:26. Places that are of importance in this section or in this period of Old Testament history: Haran, the land of Canaan, which will be promised to Abraham. Sodom and Gomorrah, obviously going to be destroyed for their wickedness. Egypt, and then important people. Abraham obviously is going to play a very, very critical role in this entire section, and his wife Sarah. Of course, they were Abram and Sarai before their names were changed by God. Lot, who is Abraham's nephew. Isaac, this is Abraham's son that was promised. His wife Rebekah. They're going to have twin sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob will have his name changed to Israel, which means he who prevails with God, for obvious reasons, because they're going to be favored by God throughout Old Testament history. Not favored in the sense that God loves them more, but they are the vehicle, the means, or the mode by which the Messiah is going to come into the world. And so you're going to have a special emphasis and focus on that family. Jacob married Rachel and Leah. Esau, who is sometimes referred to as Edom, at least his descendants, the nation of Edom, that was Jacob's brother. We mentioned this last week. Jacob and Esau, they had their issues. They made peace. Their descendants never really did. Jacob has 12 sons and one daughter. Dinah was the daughter. The sons, there we use a little acronym, girls, JJZ band. That's not an order. I gave a homework assignment. I did actually have one person who did the homework assignment. I got an email, and so they were actually put in order. I'll leave that to you to look at. I won't go and try to look up that email just to give them to you all in order, but those are not in order with the acronym. That's just for memorization purposes. Joseph was Jacob's favorite son. Obviously, most of us are familiar with that. He was given a coat of many colors. You see the danger of favoritism in a family caused a lot of problems. But because Joseph was faithful to God, God blessed him, sometimes providentially, sometimes in a miraculous way, giving him interpretations to dreams and such. And then he ends up being, even in spite of all the things that people do to try to hurt and harm him, he ends up being second in command in Egypt. And then, of course, Judah is important in this section. Not a whole lot about Judah, but the main thing here is just that this is the son through whom the Messiah is going to come. So the Messiah will come from the tribe of Judah. Jesus came, of course, through that tribe. That's important later on because the Hebrews writer is going to make a very important distinction on that. Jesus cannot be a priest on this earth because priests had to come from the tribe of Levi. He's from the tribe of Judah. So that's about where we left off. We did cover this slide. We began talking about important verses and events. Genesis 12, 1 through 3, also verse 7. Genesis 22, 18, the call of Abraham. In Genesis 12 and 7. Genesis 12, 1 through 3 and 7. And then the promises to him. Those are listed there in 1 through 3. Repeated again in shorter form in Genesis 22, 18. But those promises were a nation that would come from him, a great nation, land, God promised him, his descendants more particularly, a land, and a seed promise. The nation, of course, is the nation of Israel. The land was the promised land, or Canaan, and the seed was, in the more immediate sense, Isaac, but it's really looking to Jesus the Christ. And Paul points that out in Galatians 3:16. The promises were repeated in Genesis 26 and 28 to Isaac and Jacob, respectively. And then that's where we left off from last week. I think what I'm going to do, I kind of varied on this last week, and I wrestle sometimes with how to do it and fit everything in the time frame that we have because I don't want to spend too much time on one period so then I end up having to rush through the others. I think what I'm going to do today is go through the slides and do the more overview and then see how we're doing on time, and if we can, we'll get a little bit more detail about some of what's going on here in Genesis 12 through 50. More important verses and events. Genesis 32, 28. This is where Jacob's name is changed to Israel, and it's the first time we read that word in the Bible. You want to turn to Genesis 32. This is where Jacob is wrestling with an angel. He's actually just about to meet up again with Esau. He's very, I guess nervous would be the word. He's kind of nervous about this, and so he's going to stay behind, and he sleeps, and as he's dreaming, he's wrestling with this angel. The angel says in verse 27, "What is thy name?" He said, "Jacob." He said, "Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel, for as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed." Does anybody have a note in your Bible there? What translation of Israel? Some translations or some people translate it as names, by the way, in Hebrew almost always, maybe fair to say always, had a meaning. And sometimes you'll see that significance come out. We talked about last week Isaac being named Laughter because when Sarah heard she was going to have a baby, she's past childbearing years. She's never had a child. She's been barren. And all of a sudden she hears, "Oh, you're going to have a baby." Well, she laughed. And, why did you laugh? Well, I didn't laugh. Yes, you did. And so when Isaac is born, they name him Laughter, Isaac. But Israel, I think some may have it translated something like Prince of God or something like that, but Prince with God, strives with God. That one, and again, it just depends on who's most. I think probably the more accurate would be the idea of a prince with God or one who prevails with God. It's the idea that God is going to show favor to this family. Again, it's not because, man, they're just such great people. They're better than everybody else. That's not it at all. It's not God saying, I just love these people more than other folks. That's not it at all. It's a specific purpose for bringing in the Messiah. But names will mean something, and we'll see that sometimes as we go throughout Old Testament history, and we've talked about it before in other contexts. Just the names of God. We did a series of sermons, I don't know, it's been a few years ago, but where we looked at names of God and what those names mean. And they're not, it's not that this is God's name or that is God's name, but their meaning is descriptive of God and who he is and what he does. So Jacob's name changed to Israel. And again, that's the first time in the Bible we read that. I'm going to read a lot more after that, of course. Genesis 37 is where we shift to focusing on Joseph. In fact, if you'll look, see, I printed out my little cheat sheet here of Genesis chapter by chapter so I don't forget some of these. That was in Genesis 32. Jacob and Esau have their peaceful reunion in chapter 33. Okay, here it is. Genesis, I was thinking it was 36, but I wasn't sure about that. Genesis 36. When you look there, these are the generations of Esau, and he talks a lot about the dukes of Edom and things like that, and it's looking at Esau's generations, and at 37:1, the Bible really shifts focus, and at least Old Testament-wise, and it zooms in on the family of Jacob, and that's that transition begins to tell us about Joseph and Jacob's favoritism toward him and all that ends up happening because of that. He's sold into slavery by his brothers who are jealous. He ends up in Egypt, but of course God is with him. Genesis 39, if you want to look over Genesis 39, verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph. He was a prosperous man. He was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. This is, of course, Potiphar's house. Potiphar's wife is going to try to seduce Joseph, and when he won't take the bait, she lies about him, and he ends up being cast into prison by his master, Potiphar. And in verse 21 of Genesis 39, but the Lord was with Joseph, showed him mercy, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. So Joseph just keeps following God, and even when people mistreat him, God is still with him, and many times blessing him in spite of all that. Long story short, with Joseph, Jacob and his entire family are going to move to Egypt. Try to have a little more to say about that here in just a moment. They're going to move to Egypt. They were 70 in number at the time. If you skip over to Genesis 46. Verse 27. The sons of Joseph, which were born him in Egypt, were 2 souls. All the souls of the house of Jacob, which came into Egypt, were 70, or again 70. So 70 in number at that time. Yeah, let's go ahead and finish. I was thinking about talking a little bit more about that, but sometimes I fight this temptation to talk more, and I won't get through my lesson if I do that, but hopefully we can come back to that a little bit. Some questions and lessons from this section that we want to make sure we don't move on without covering. Who are the Israelites? Just your most basic definition. Descendants of Jacob or descendants of Israel, same person. And sometimes you'll see Jacob used, sometimes you'll see Israel used. Which brings us to our next question. What are the different meanings of Israel in the Bible, or at least in the Old Testament? In the New Testament, you actually have Israel applied to the church. And sometimes people have the idea that God is going to gather Israel and that they're, Sometimes people even say this in politics. We got to support Israel. That's God's people. Israel still is God's people, but it's not a physical nation or people. It's the church. But what are the different meanings of Israel? At least let's just narrow it down to the Old Testament. We know one. Do we? Jacob, right? Jacob is Israel. And sometimes, again, you'll see that used one way or the other, and you have to look contextually. It's not usually that difficult to figure out who's being talked about. What is the other one? Yeah, it means prince with God, but what's the other usage? When the Bible talks about Israel, it might be talking about Jacob. It might be talking about the nation. Yeah, and that's probably the one we're most familiar with. The nation of Israel. But there's another usage that you're going to get into on down in Old Testament history. Think period 9. Yeah, there you go. The northern kingdom. This is after the nation splits. Excuse me. After the kingdom splits, you have a kingdom in the north, kingdom in the south, 10 tribes in the north, 2 tribes in the south, Judah and Benjamin. By far, the largest tribe in the south is Judah. So the nation becomes just known as the southern kingdom, just becomes known as Judah. But you'll see references to Israel, and that's typically almost always after the divided kingdom. That's a reference to the northern kingdom specifically. And then there's another usage that comes even further down in Old Testament history. Think period 12. What? Somebody said something. Yeah, after they come back home, after the captivity, they're just collectively called Israel again, because there's no more northern kingdom, southern kingdom. The northern kingdom ceased to exist. When we talked about this, no lost tribes. People from every tribe came back, but they no longer had, the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom. It's just Israel. So bear that in mind. Depending on where you are in Old Testament history, when you read about Israel, you might be reading about the man Israel, Jacob. You might be reading about the nation before the kingdom split. You might be reading about the northern kingdom before it fell. Or you might be reading about the collective group of the Jews after they returned from captivity. It's all going to depend on where you are in Old Testament history. And again, that's why I think this study is so helpful, because you read that and you can go, every time you read the word Israel, okay, who's this talking about? Or what is this talking about? And I think that's helpful. Some more questions and lessons here. Why does the Old Testament, we've touched on this some already, but why does the Old Testament emphasize the nation of Israel? I think there are 2 reasons that we could really center on. 2 main reasons. Let me get a couple of volunteers to read. Our Brother Martin, Nehemiah 9, 7, and 8. You're looking at me, Billy. You know you want to read. Deuteronomy 7, 6 through 8. While they're getting there, Genesis 22:18, God says, "In thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice." Who is that spoken to? Abraham. So I think that's reason number 1, we could say, Israel's relationship to Abraham. God's promises, really. And that's Galatians 3:16 too, by the way, that we mentioned last week. Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He saith not, as unto thy seeds as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed, which is Christ. Nehemiah 9, 7, and 8. All right, God chose Abraham, changed his name, chose Abram, changed his name to Abraham, promised to give his seed all the land of promise, all the land of Canaan. And he says, you've done that because you're faithful. So again, that relationship to Abraham. Deuteronomy 7, 6 through 8. All right, when you get to Deuteronomy, this is after the bondage in Exodus. And Moses is saying it's really getting near the end of the wilderness wanderings, right before they go into the promised land. But Moses tells them just what we said a moment ago. It's not because they were so much better than anybody else. It's not because you were so numerous. Wow, look at this mighty nation. I'm going to call that my people. He says, you were the least of all the people. But God made an oath, a promise to Abraham. So that's the first key, and tying in with that promise and that relationship to Abraham is the promise of the Messiah. That was one of the promises. So we could make the point here that when Jesus was on earth, he was an Israelite. See that in Matthew 1:1 in the genealogy. God chose one nation, that was the nation of Israel, Abraham's descendants, from which he chose one virgin, Mary, to give birth to the one Savior of the world, Jesus the Christ. So the Old Testament emphasizes the nation of Israel because of that relationship to Abraham, and several people said this, and that's really the overarching answer, is to bring in the Messiah. That's why there's so much focus. But that was part of that promise, that oath to Abraham: land, nation, seed. And that's why Israel is emphasized over and over and over in the Old Testament. Why did Joseph end up in Egypt? Who was sold into slavery by his brothers. He ended up in Potiphar's house. Then Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him. He won't take the bait, so she lies. He ends up in prison. He interprets dreams. One guy gets out of prison. Later on, Pharaoh has a couple of dreams. He can't figure out what does this mean. And was the butler, right? Yes, the butler, the baker. Yeah, the baker was the one that ended up dying. The butler, he says, oh man, now I remember. I was supposed to remember this guy when I came out of prison. You need to send for this fellow that's in the prison, Pharaoh. He can tell you. I had a dream. The baker had a dream. He told us exactly what it meant. It came to pass just like he said. You need to send for Joseph. And, of course, Joseph ends up there in Egypt, second in command. He interprets the dreams. There's a famine coming. There's 7 years of plenty first, but then there's going to be 7 years of famine so bad, you won't even think about the 7 years of plenty. It's going to be so severe. He says, here's what I counsel you to do. Take advantage of the 7 years of plenty. Save, save, save. Store it up. Then when the famine hits, you're ready. You've got stuff saved up. Pharaoh says, hey, this is genius. And Joseph, part of that interpretation, says, you need to put somebody in charge of that. Pharaoh says, hey, who better than you? So he puts him in charge. He says, you'll answer only to me. So basically, he becomes second in command. But there's another reason, an overarching reason. It's one word. Providence. God's providence put him there. Now, there was some miraculous along the way. Obviously, Joseph has to have those dreams revealed to him. Nobody just guesses the meaning of those dreams, whether in the prison or Pharaoh's dreams. But this is all God's providence, because what happens after the 7 years of plenty? 7 years of famine. So bad you're not even going to remember the 7 years of plenty. What happens to Israel without Joseph in place there, interpreting the dream, warning them of it, saying you need to save up, you need to be ready? What happens to the seed line of the Messiah? It's eliminated. They die in the famine. So you see providence at work here. God is preserving the seed of Israel, the ancestors of the coming Messiah. In fact, Joseph, when he's revealing himself to his brethren, Genesis 45, 5 through 7. This would be after. Right at the time when he's revealing himself to his brethren. Just after that, they're terrified, as you can imagine. I mean, here's your brother. You sent off into slavery. You lied to your dad. And, well, I guess wild beasts just must have eaten him up. And now all of a sudden you find out, uh-oh, he's alive. He's well. And, oh, by the way, he's second in command in the most powerful nation in the world at that time. Yikes. So they did not. He disguised himself to look like an Egyptian. He had learned the language. He speaks to them very roughly in this, I don't know exactly, I guess it would be an Egyptian language. But he didn't speak to them in their language, spoke to them through a translator. They had no idea. There were clues that maybe they should have picked up on, but I guess in their mind, not in fairness, we're reading this after the fact. I can see for them, they think he's dead and gone, long gone. So no, they don't recognize him. In fact, that's verses 1 through 4. He reveals himself to them. He says, I'm Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt, verse 4. But he says in verse 5, now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves that you sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years in the which there shall neither be earing nor harvest. He says, 5 more years to go. You think it's bad now. And God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity in the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. And then if you go over to Genesis 50, everything just, it's one big happy family again. But then in Genesis 50, well, now Joseph dies. Not Joseph, Jacob, their father. And so the brethren are kind of, this is not good. Verse 15 of Genesis 50, when they saw their father was dead, they said, Joseph will peradventure hate us and will certainly requite us all the evil which we did unto him. They acknowledged they did him wrong. And they knew that by now, and they've shown penitence. In fact, he has a little test for them, remember, before he revealed himself to them. He says, you're not going to see my face again unless you bring your youngest brother, which was who? Benjamin. They go back and Jacob says, absolutely not. You've already robbed me of one son, not a chance. And they said, what do you want us to do, Dad? The man says we can't get any more grain unless we bring our youngest brother. He says, why did you even tell him you had a younger brother? Well, he asked us about our family. They don't have a clue. And so Jacob says, no, he's not going. And so he just kind of puts his foot down, and so some time kind of passes along, and they're getting hungry. We need grain. Why are you just standing here looking at each other? Go get some grain. Well, we told you what the man said. And so they say, okay. Jacob finally relents and says, he can go. They say, we're going to answer for him. So they go, and of course Joseph devises the little plan. And I used to read that and think, he's kind of getting back at him a little bit. But I think as I study that more, that's not really in keeping with Joseph's character. I think what he's doing is testing his brethren. So he goes along and he says, he has them place his cup. Where is it? It would be about chapter. Oh. It's going to be about 45 or 46, I think. 44, okay. Yeah, so he tells the steward, fill their sacks with food as much as they can carry, put every man's money in his sack's mouth, put my cup, the silver cup, in the sack's mouth of the youngest. That's Benjamin's, of course, and his corn money, grain money. And he did according to the word that Joseph had spoken, and so they go on their way, and then they go, and Joseph sends them and says, follow them, and when you overtake them, why have you rewarded evil for good, into verse 4. So why have you done evil? Or you have done evil in so doing, at the end of verse 5. So they say, he does that, verse 6. And so they say, no, God forbid thy servant should do according to this thing. The money which we found in our sacks' mouths, We brought again into the land of Canaan. Remember, by the way, when they left the first time, Joseph had his servants put their money back. They came and they bought grain. He says, give them their money back secretly. They get home, and man, now they are torn up. Oh, man, not only is he saying we can't see his face again, except we bring our youngest brother, we got our money back. Somebody has put the money back, and he's going to think we stole the grain. They don't know Joseph did that. And so they're upset, and he'd done that before, but he tells them again, this is what you're going to do. But they say, look, we were innocent in that the first time, but we're not going to steal out of your house silver or gold, verse 8. With whomsoever you find it, let him die, and we also will be my Lord's bondmen. He says, well, you let it be according to your words. With the one with whom it's found shall be my servant, and the rest of you are going to be blameless. How are they going to treat their younger brother? That's what Joseph wants to know. Are they still rascals? So he searched, began at the eldest and left at the youngest. Again, not by accident. The cup was found in Benjamin's sack. Man, they rend their clothes. Oh, they're upset. They go back to the city. This is back into Egypt. Judah and his brethren came to Joseph's house. He was yet there. They fall before him on the ground. Joseph says, what have you done? And Judah says, what are we going to say? What can we say? We are your servants. And in fact, he even says, he's thinking back to what they did earlier. Verse 16, Judah says, God hath found out the iniquity of thy servants. Behold, we are my Lord's servants, both we and he also with whom the cup is found. Joseph says, nope, it's going to be the one that has the cup. You can go in peace. Well, are they going to look out for their own hide again? And no doubt it had to please Joseph when Judah steps up and says, listen, you asked, do we have a father or brother? We told you. And this poor father, our brother is dead. But here's this child of his old age. And man, he loves this boy. And you said, bring him down, and we did. We told our father that, and he didn't want us to go, but we did. So here we are. And he says, I'm trying to get down to the main part. It shall come to pass, verse 31, when he seeth that the lad is not with us, he'll die. And thy servant shall bring down the gray hairs of thy servant, our father, with sorrow to the grave. For thy servant, Judah says, I was surety for the lad unto my father, saying, if I bring him not unto thee, then I shall bear the blame to my father forever. I pray thee, let me, he says, let thy servant abide instead of the lad, a bondman to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brethren. For how shall I go up to my father, and the lad be not with me, lest peradventure I see the evil that shall come on my father? He says, I'll stay. I'll be your servant. I'll be your slave. Please just let him go back to his father. Well, after Jacob dies, they say, now he's going to get revenge. He tested them. He saw that they've learned from their mistakes. And now Joseph says, they sent a message to Joseph there in chapter 50. Oh, your father commanded, tell Joseph, forgive your brethren. This is what Dad wanted. That's all he wanted, was just for you to forgive us. They're scared to death. But Joseph, getting to the point we're making here in verse 20, says, as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. He says, God did this. This is God's providence to save many people alive. Yeah, you did wrong. God didn't make that choice for you, but God turned that choice, that bad choice, that sinful choice. In spite of that, he's blessing many people. So God's providence put him there. More questions and lessons here. The Messiah or the peace giver? We have peace with God through Romans 5:1. Through whom? Through Jesus Christ. The Messiah or the peace giver was going to come from the tribe of Judah. You see that in Genesis 49:10. Here's a prophecy of the Messiah. Scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come. That's the peace giver. And unto him shall the gathering of the people be. And he's been gathering people to him ever since that first day of Pentecost after the resurrection. Those who will come to him in obedience. When Joseph died in Egypt, what were the conditions of Jacob's descendants there? It was great. Excellent. In fact, in Exodus 1, verse 7, I realize that's getting out of our section here a little bit, but in Exodus 1:7, There's the children of Israel, fruitful, increased abundantly, multiplied, waxed exceeding mighty, or grew exceedingly mighty. The land was filled with them. That's going to change very soon. Of course, going to get a new king that doesn't know Joseph. Memory verse for this particular section, Mark 7:7, howbeit in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. So that's a very abbreviated patriarchal period of Old Testament history, period number 3. I was looking through my notes here in fact, I've got this. This is another one I'll give you if you want a copy. Genesis chapter by chapter. A lot happens in this section that we just, for time's sake, can't cover. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah happens in Genesis 18. It's kind of announced, and 19 is where you actually see the destruction. Abraham gets ahead of God and takes Hagar. Remember, Sarah says, here, take Hagar and have a son by her. Ishmael is born, and boy, the troubles that have come from that, because they decided to get ahead of God and not wait on God, and so all the Arabic peoples are descended from Ishmael. Genesis, man, there's so much here that I want to talk about. In Genesis, I love the study of the book of Genesis. I think we've gotten the highlights. I'm just looking to see if any of these, where I missed anything. We talked about the peaceful reunion in chapter 33 between Jacob and Esau. The generations of Esau in 36, then it shifts to Joseph, and from that point on in the Old Testament, it focuses on Israel. Joseph's 2 sons were born in Egypt. I don't know that we talked about that a whole lot. Ephraim and Manasseh, those are going to become 2 of the tribes. Joseph's double blessing. Of course, Levi does not have an inheritance because the Lord is their inheritance. They'll receive those 48 Levitical cities in the land. Pharaoh's dreams are in chapter 41, by the way, and Joseph's going to interpret them there. And then Joseph's brethren first come to Egypt to buy corn in chapter 42. And then we talked about Joseph revealing himself to his brethren. They settle in Goshen, chapter 47. That's kind of, I didn't really mention Goshen as an important place, but it kind of almost is, because when you get into bondage in Exodus, period number 4, that's where Israel is. They're settled in Goshen. By the way, we're going to talk a little bit more about that tonight in one of our Lost in the Credits lessons. Some characters in the Bible who are lost in the credits. We're actually looking at 2 tonight that are not very well known, but boy, did they play an important role in biblical history. Jacob blesses Joseph's children. Ephraim is set before Manasseh. Of course, Ephraim is going to become a much larger tribe, by the way, much larger and numerous tribe than Manasseh. That's in chapter 48. Jacob blesses his sons and prophesies concerning their future in chapter 49, and Jacob dies there toward the end of chapter 49. And then Jacob is buried, and you see Joseph's kindness to his brethren here at the end of the book, and Joseph dies, and that's why we say period 3 ends with the death of Joseph. The call of Abraham to the death of Joseph. What we'll do next week, Lord willing, is we'll review this period of Old Testament history, have some review questions, and then jump right into period number 4, bondage and Exodus. This being period number 4 is a little more familiar. Most people are pretty familiar with the events of Exodus 1 through 14, which is where that period is found. So probably try to move through that a little quicker and hopefully cover it in one class. I may try to do like I did today and hit my slides quickly, and then what time we have left, come back. I've got another chapter by chapter for the book of Exodus. I've done this, not every Old Testament book. I've done every New Testament book, but not every Old Testament book. But I have a number of these where we're covering such a span of chapters, and I think that the chapter by chapter is helpful. So if you want that to put in with your other notes, that's fine. Again, I have it electronically. That's no problem. Anything from PowerPoints to handouts to something I even just mentioned, if I can share something with you that helps you, I am more than glad to do so. Just let me know. So we'll pick up next week, review period 3, jump into period 4, bondage and Exodus. Thank you very much. Let's have a break before worship this morning. Thank you.